This is Land of Havilah, Job 24. Job goes on now speaking about injustices in the earth and wondering why God allows them. Verse 1. Why aren't times laid up by the Almighty? Why don't those who know Him see His days? Comment. He wants to know why is it that those who know God sometimes die young? Why doesn't God reserve some days for them? As for other perceived injustices, verse 2. There are people who remove the landmarks. They violently take away flocks and feed them. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless, and they take the widow's ox for a pledge. They turn the needy out of the way. The poor of the earth all hide themselves. Behold, as wild donkeys in the desert, they go out to their work, seeking diligently for food. The wilderness yields them bread for their children. Comment. Job says it's a travesty. The poor have to find their sustenance like wild donkeys in the desert. There's not much for them, but somehow they eke it out. Still speaking of the difficulties of the poor, verse 6, they cut their food in the field. They glean the vineyard of the wicked. Comment. After the wicked man's field has been harvested, the poor have to come in and scavenge whatever they can find. If Job could stand before God, he would ask Him about all this. It's also a travesty that, verse 7, they lie all night naked without clothing and have no covering in the cold. They are wet with the showers of the mountains and embrace the rock for lack of a shelter. There are those who pluck the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge of the poor, so that they go around naked without clothing. Being hungry, they carry the sheaves. They make oil within the walls of these men. They tread wine presses and suffer thirst. Comment. In verse 9, the poor lose their children to servitude. The children of the poor get plucked from their mother's breasts and taken away. The poor lose their clothing to debt and go naked. They work in the field, binding and carrying sheaves of grain, but can't partake of the harvest and go hungry because it's not their field. Likewise, they process the rich man's olives for oil and grapes for wine, but can't partake. And why, Job would ask, verse 12. From out of the populous city men groan. The soul of the wounded cries out, yet God doesn't regard the folly. Comment. Why are the cities full of landless peasants who groan in poverty? Now, switching subjects from the poor, there's another class of people that sets Job wondering. He doesn't understand why God allows the wicked to be the way they are. Verse 13. These are of those who rebel against the light. They don't know its ways nor stay in its paths. The murderer rises with the light. He kills the poor and needy. In the night he's like a thief. The eye also of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, No eye shall see me. He disguises his face. Comment. Why does God allow this, Job wants to know. In verses 14 to 15, people get away with murder in broad daylight, or at night, it doesn't matter, and adulterers get away with adultery. He's saying the situation isn't as simple as you make it out to be, my friends. If the law of sowing and reaping was consistent, we wouldn't see all these inexplicable situations. Still speaking of the wicked, verse 16. In the dark they dig through houses. They shut themselves up in the daytime. They don't know the light, for the morning is to all of them like thick darkness, for they know the terrors of the thick darkness. Their foam on the surface of the waters. Their portion is cursed in the earth. They don't turn into the way of the vineyards. Drought and heat consume the snow waters, so does Sheol those who have sinned. Comment. Verse 16, the wicked are creatures of the night. They dig through others' houses in the dark, seeking what they can steal or acquire through unrighteousness. And when morning comes, they shut themselves in. In verse 17, the wicked hate the light of morning. They're more comfortable in the dark. In verse 18, they don't do honest work, such as in the vineyards. But in verse 19, eventually Sheol will consume them, even though they were prosperous in life. But that still leaves the question, why did they get away with it for so long? Still speaking of the wicked, verse 20. The womb shall forget him, the worm shall feed sweetly on him. He shall be no more remembered. Unrighteousness shall be broken as a tree. He devours the barren who don't bear. He shows no kindness to the widow. Comment. The wicked man is deeply corrupt. In verse 20, even his mother will drift away from him and forget him. In verse 21, he devours the barren, meaning he has no pity on those with nothing. He'll wipe them out in a heartbeat. So the wicked manage to make their way, and God allows them to do so, more often than Job would like, But also God does this, verse 22. Yet God preserves the mighty by his power. He rises up who has no assurance of life. God gives them security, and they rest in it. His eyes are on their ways. They are exalted, yet a little while and they're gone. Yes, they are brought low. They are taken out of the way as all others, and are cut off as the tops of the ears of grain. If it isn't so now, who'll prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? Comment in verse 22, God preserves the mighty as well. In situations you think could kill a person, the mighty rises up thanks to God. God gives him security and rest. But in a little while he's gone like everyone else. In verse 25, Job closes with a question. He says, "Isn't it so?" Meaning, isn't it true that God does all these inexplicable things? So how is it that you think you have it all figured out, my friends? Isaiah 2:12 speaks of a day of reckoning. It's true that God doesn't always make a person settle up in this life. The full settling of accounts will occur on the day of reckoning. Job 25 is next.